Welcome back, everybody. This will be part 3 of our getting started in precision rimfire competition. In part 1, we picked a rifle and an optic. Part 2, we mounted the optic and built a basic profile. And today for part 3, we are going to zero this gun and true up the data in our Kestrel or other ballistic app, so that we can hopefully get first round impacts downrange. So the first thing we're going to do is zero the scope, but we're going to use my Garmin here to collect data along the way, because we will use this for the second part, which will be to true up our data. So we'll get this fired up. If you haven't played with one of these Garmins yet, you're missing out. Excuse me. They are very simple. So, if this were a bolt action rifle, I would remove the bolt and I would set my bag up so that my looking through the barrel, I'm centered on that target, and then I would adjust my optic to be kind of close to that. In this particular case, we're shooting my semi-auto and I cannot do that. So we have a couple of things that we can do. Now this optic should be pretty close. It's come off of other similar rifles and I could probably be on paper. But we've got a bunch of dirt out there, and so it's really easy to spot where we're hitting in regards to where we're aiming. So I think I'm going to send my first round just into the dirt. We'll see if that gets us close, and then we'll move up onto paper. So I'm going to send it. There's a good little rock to aim at right in the foreground. Okay, and I hit about 1 mil low. So I'm going to come up roughly 1 mil. My windage looked close. Make sure my parallax is good. And we're just going to go right to the paper. I've got whatever 6 or so little dots down there, 8 dots. I'm just going to go dead center. Okay, so what I did there, I sent 5 rounds. I don't really want to make an adjustment off of 1 or 2. And then I'm going to look through the scope and I'm going to measure based off of my point of aim and my point of impact. And I'm going to make an adjustment in the scope there. And it looks like I'm about 2/10 low. So I'm going to come up 2 more tenths. And we do got a little bit of right to left wind out there, and I'm seeing that downrange. I'm going to move to a new dot. So that was only 4 because I sent the first one. And I got, oh, 1's right on, a little bit high on 2. I'm going to come down 1 more dot, or 1 more tenth, I'm sorry. And then I'm going to check my wind just so we can see what we should expect. And first I got to calibrate my compass. Okay, so my compass is calibrated. I've got about a 3 mile an hour wind from about 4 o'clock, 4:30. So that's only a tenth. But this is an important step when you're actually zeroing. You don't want to zero in the conditions, and then if you have wind, it's pushing you, but you zero it not accounting for that. So that tenth, that means my impacts should be about a tenth left. And they're not. They're pretty centered up. So I'm actually gonna go a tenth left. And let's send a few more rounds and see what that does. And we had a malfunction. Okay, so elevation, I'm pretty dang good. Those impacts were hitting close to 2/10 left, 10th and a half. So that's pretty close to in line with the information I put in my Kestrel. So we're gonna call that good. So at this point, I want to slip my turrets back. Now, that's going to vary depending on your rifle scope. You're going to want to follow whatever manufacturer's recommendations are. This one is relatively simple. Because the zero stop is in the turret, we just reset it to 0 and retighten the screws. So I should be back to 0 there on elevation. We're gonna slip my windage turret. Okay, so my turrets are slipped back to 0. Now, one thing, this is at 50 yards, and I choose a 50-yard zero because I feel like at 25 yards, it's hard to see any little tiny difference. You know, a tenth off at 25 yards is less than the bullet width. So at 50, it refines that zero. It makes it a little bit easier. But I'm gonna go out to 100 now and send them, and I still may make a little more adjustment. But for the most part, that's where my zero is gonna be. So now we're gonna get into truing our data. Okay, so if you remember from our last video, when we built this basic profile, there was a couple pieces of information that I wasn't particularly concerned about. One of those was muzzle velocity, one of those was BC. So the muzzle velocity we're gonna correct right now. That's why I have the Garmin set up. And I believe I just put 1070, just your standard off of the box information. In this particular gun, off of those, whatever, 20, 30 shots that we've sent, I have a average muzzle velocity of 1077. So I'm gonna go into my profile and I'm gonna adjust that. Now, I'm running a G7 BC. Again, we talked about the benefits of if you were running a G1 or G7 or a custom drag curve. It doesn't really matter which one. This is that next step. We're going to true that information up. So I started with the 0.066 G7, and with my trued velocity, that's calling for a 1.8 at 100. We do have a wind change. It's kind of coming at about 6:30, 7 o'clock for this target direction. So that should be about a 4 to 5/10 hold. So we're gonna send a few rounds at our 100 and see if that lines up. So here I want to make sure that my gun is level, and I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to send 4 or 5 rounds, and then I'm going to measure in the scope to see where they hit in regards to my point of aim. First, I'm going to load around. Okay, so windage is actually pretty good, which is kind of bad because it's calling for wind. My elevation, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the middle of that group. That group is about 2/10 tall. But it's high. So I'm about 2/10 overall. So now I'm going to go into my Kestrel and I'm going to adjust my BC, right? Because it's calling for more elevation than is needed. So I dialed the 1.8 like it says, and my rounds are hitting high. So if that's the case, my BC is actually better than what it is listed in the Kestrel. So I'm going to go down to my BC and I'm going to adjust that up a little bit. So that it brings my elevation down. I'm also going to go in, my speeds are a little bit quicker. Okay. Let's make sure that my environment is updated just so we don't screw any of that up. And I'm going to pull the wind out. Right now I can feel it on the back of my neck. It's about a straight tailwind. So I'm actually going to go in and put that in. I'm going to put it at 6 o'clock at 3 miles an hour. Okay, and I'm going to send a couple more. Okay, and those are all still high. So I'm going to bring that BC up a little more till it gets me in line with what I'm seeing downrange. Okay. So that one, they were drifting to the left, and that is what I'm seeing for wind as well. But I'm still trending high. So before I make that big of an adjustment, I'm going to come back to 50 yards and make sure that my 0 isn't trending high. So we'll swing back over here. I'm going to come back to 0. And I'll send a couple rounds. And I am about a 1/10 high. So that's part of what we're seeing downrange. So confirm that. I'm going to go back to 100. I'm going to take that 1/10 out. And I'm going to see what happens. Okay, and that put it where I need to be. So that tells me that at my 50, I did have it a little bit an extra 1/10, and then my BC was a little bit low. So I'm going to go back to 0. I'm going to go down that 1/10, and I'm going to reslip that turret. Okay, guys, so now we have established our 50-yard 0 is good. And we've trued our BC out to 100 yards. And if I had more time, I would check that at various yardages in between there. But in my experience, that's going to be close enough. So what I want to do now is I want to go out to distance and true this up. Now in the past, I have always just gone out to distance and adjusted my BC to get them to line up. What I've noticed more recently is I can't ever get them to line up both inside range and outside. And so what I've been doing in matches lately has been running multiple profiles. And so I'll run a profile for everything, say 120 yards and in, and then I would run a different profile for 120 yards and out, and that's worked okay, but I'm not satisfied with it. So the Kestrel has a DSF function. It stands for drop scale factor, maybe drop scale something. And what that does is it's a percentage of your BC as you go to difference. So we're going to attempt that here and see if we can add those points. So essentially, we're taking our BC to a known distance that it's good. We're going to enter a point at the end of that known distance that it's good. And then we're going to start adding multiple points out, which is changing our curve, and it's making it line up with what we're seeing in the real world. So I'm going to bring my Kestrel up, and hopefully I can make it so that you can see this. Okay, so I'm getting into my menu screen. I'm going to scroll down. This is on gun. And here we have a calibrate DSF. Okay, so I'm going to enter that. It pulls up the target that I was already on, right? So it's 100 yards. The drop is good. I'm going to call that good. Okay, now I'm going to go up to my next target distance. And ideally you would want to walk this out 100 yards, 125, 150, 175. I don't have those targets out there, so I'm going to go straight to 200. That's calling for 6.6 mils. And we're going to send around and we're going to see what happens. And just so you guys are aware, I have my Garmin chronograph on here for this whole process. Because if I have like a really fast shot or slow shot, that's going to affect my point of impact, and I want to eliminate that if I can. So we're going to send 5 rounds. Okay, and those rounds are low, so that's telling me I need to come up. It's kind of miragey out there. That's telling me I need to come up like 3/10. So I'm going to go back in there on that target. So I'm on that 200-yard target. I'm going to go back into gun, scroll back down to DSF, calibrate DSF, and I'm going to, that's calling for 6.6. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to move that up to 6.9. Exit, accept. So now it has me at 6.9. I'm going to send a couple more just to confirm that. Perfect elevation. Okay, so those are good on elevation. I'm gonna call that good. So now we're gonna take that and we're gonna go out to the really far range, and it should factor in that DSF. So we're gonna adjust it and we're gonna shoot at 400 yards and see if we line up there. So now we're going to try our 400 yards. It's calling for 20.6. We got a pretty good wind out there. There's a lot of holes already on that. Let's send it straight up. Didn't see it. Malfunction. hitting it, I just can't tell where. Okay guys, so I had to run down there to see because I couldn't see exactly on the plate where they were hitting, and I was a little bit low, so I brought it up about 8/10, and I entered that in on my Cal DSF just like I did on my 200 yard, and that's hitting where we need to be for the water line. So the last step would just be to kind of go through and pick some miscellaneous targets and test that to make sure your curve lines up. So as a recap, excuse me, we zeroed our rifle. We talked about if you had a bolt gun, you could bore sight it first. If you don't have a bolt gun and you're just nowhere off, rather than bring your target up, just shoot somewhere in the dirt to get an idea of where you're at. Bring your turrets up and re-zero them. Go out to distance to check that your elevation is good. If you recall, I went out and I was a little bit off, so I came back to 50 and I took a 1/10 out of it. I adjusted my BC for 100 yards to get it to line up with a true muzzle velocity, and then we started to go out to distance. So I went out to 200 yards, shot what it was calling for, entered a DSF calibration. That brought me up a little bit. Went out to 400 yards, did the same thing. So I had to come up about 3/10 at 200 yards versus what the solver said, and almost 8/10 at 413 yards. So that is the end of this video. I appreciate you guys for watching. I hope you're getting something out of this, and stay tuned for the next one. Thanks guys. I hope I see you on the range.